Hi, everyone. It's Siddhi from Voice in the Age of the Machine, a field guide for makers of the future. This series features profiles of artists of all kinds all over the world who are co-creating with AI and exploring how technology can serve imagination, not override it. Today, I'm speaking with Henry Daubrez. Henry has been producing emotionally striking work at the intersection of art, technology, and cinematic storytelling, and he's actually one of the creators who really inspired me to want to do this project and spend more time talking with artists who are working at this really incredible moment in creative history. Henry's career has spanned immersive installations, interactive design, and direction, but his current focus pushes the very boundaries of what's possible with the medium. He was among the first artists to direct a fully generative short film using Google's Veo2 model. That film, Kitsune, if you haven't seen it, is incredible. Watch it on your own, watch it with your kids. Some folks have described it to me as having almost a Disney-like aesthetic, and yet it was generated entirely inside the machine. Henry followed that up with Electric Pink, which is a short that premiered at Tribeca this year. And these films aren't just technical feats, in my opinion. They're pretty profound explorations of what narrative and aesthetics can look like in the generative era. So I'm psyched today to talk to Henry about the creative systems behind these projects, how he's maintained visual and emotional consistency, and how he protects voice and originality inside of generative workflows. So Henry, thank you for being here. It's really awesome to have you.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's always great to be able to talk about all of this.
You began your journey in immersive design and visual storytelling. Was there a scene, a film, an installation, a memory early in your life that made you say, this is how I want to express myself?
So I was born in the 80s, and like I think a lot of kids of my generation, we kind of grew up in front of TV in the pre-internet era, which was pretty amazing because, like I think we had access to enough technology to have fun, but not to a point like today where it can, prevent you from doing things. And so I did watch a lot of things growing up, and always love spending time just discovering movies and TV shows and whatnot. The one film which really changed the course of my career, or like more like what I would wanted to do, is actually the Lord of the Rings. It's funny. So I randomly discovered The Hobbit the book in a store before going on vacation, and I just packed it to read in the car. Once again, back then it was early 90s, so books were perfect for the car. And then I started reading The Lord of the Rings. I loved the book, and then when the movies came out, I started, like pretty much anyone. I at the time watched them, and what was interesting is that it's by watching the bonus DVD showing how it was done and how VFX was done and the entire process, that I really discovered what I wanted to do. I was studying computer science, and it was not creative enough for me at
Yeah.
all. And so it just felt like, like, oh wow, that's what I want to do.
What was your first encounter, Henry, with the machine? So that moment where AI first entered your practice, not just as an abstract idea, but something you touched and used. And what was that initial feeling like for you?
So it was 3 years and a half ago, I think, by now. Yeah. Something called Wombo. I'm not even sure how I discovered it. I think it was someone on Twitter who mentioned it. And you could, on your mobile, you could start generating by using a prompt. So that was the first time I heard of the word, like you can prompt something. And back then it was something called V2 GAN. And I think it was fascinating because I had the feeling that I was asking for a person and I wasn't really getting the person. It was kind of a weird collage and mix of things which felt both like the person I was asking for, but at the same time not at all like. And
Right.
to me, it was still fascinating that the machine made some decisions, and I mean the algorithm and the training data was educating those decisions. But I've been spending most of my career micromanaging decisions. Like I think that's how I built uh, whatever I managed to build over time, and it felt kind of refreshing to look at things and see how I feel about it and just decide if I want to use it or not. And I would end up like cutting pieces of whatever I generate and then recompose them. But I think that was this was it felt refreshing not to take those decisions, but to still actively decide if they were good for me, what I could do with them.
That's really interesting because I think some creatives describe it to me as the opposite, where it feels like that first moment where the machine generates something. It's like, it feels like I'm surrendering control in a way that like brings up some insecurities. It feels like in some ways to you as a career micromanager, it was liberating.
Yeah, no, definitely. The thing is, I've been doing creative direction for quite a while now, meaning that I'm working with colleagues and they're building stuff, and then I can bounce off those ideas. And I do feel, at least to me, it's easier to start with something I can look at and then start dissecting and decide where I want it to go, if anywhere, versus having a blank page. I always love the idea that you look at something like, oh, this is interesting, and it could become that, and you could, create that way, and then we mix that way. And I think that's kind of how we work as humans, right? Like people doing, Pinterest boards forever because that's educating the decisions, and then mood boards. I think that's the same idea. It's just that the mood board is not something done by someone else. It's just a machine which happened to give me, the starting block.
Let's talk Kitsune. I'm amazed every time I watch it by what you've created there. And there are so many folks that I've spoken to, people who've watched it, other creators who are amazed how you achieve that very distinct high fidelity aesthetic. Some people have described it to me as the Disney look, which I don't know if that's what you were going after or not, but I'm so curious what went into making that happen and how were you able to achieve such a polished and cohesive look using generative tools?
Video was definitely not in a place where we could do a lot of things. There were a few things, and they've been there for years, but it's really abstract. And I think Veo2 was this moment where it felt like, oh, it's finally good enough to have natural movement and not just this kind of a slow motion. And it wasn't hallucinating everything you were asking, right? Like, and most of whatever was in the market at the time, I think was mostly runway
Yeah.
or Pika. At some point, after a few seconds, it started to change
Right,
into
right.
mush. And so hard to use, right? And so when I got into it, I think the first test was spending enough time understanding what the engine could and couldn't do, like what the model could do. And Veo2 and 3 are really like world builders. Like you can push our direction a lot. Like, so I could like start to ask for very precise things like a mood and a color, and everything was directed that way. And the goal was to create, first it was a stupid experiment, like, hey, I'm going to do a short film just to see how it works, and we see, if it's making sense. And the issue is that that happened during my Christmas break, and I definitely gave way too many hours to that. Like that wasn't a break anymore. I was, I kept on going, and that was exciting because I felt like I had something really special. As much as Veo is a great tool for world building, the challenge was to make sure I had consistency throughout. And
Of course.
I was
Yeah.
only relying on text. The issue is that there's so many words you can give. And so the choice to have a fox was both because, I mean, I can even see in here, I have a fox tattooed on my arm,
Was that
but
pre or post the short
no,
film?
that was that was
That was
pre, that
pre.
was like
Wow. Okay.
10 years ago. So to give you a background story, but I got this tattoo just after my mom passed away from cancer. So in 2012, and when I started working on Kitsune, the idea was that I wanted to use the fox simply because I knew that I had a limited amount of characters I could use, and that Veo is great. But if you describe too long, too much, even under the limits which is given by Google, you start losing consistency.
Yeah.
You lose action, you lose whatever details. And so I figured out that by using a fox, I could just ask for a fox, and I'm just saving like all of this where I don't have to describe a person. And um, I started to notice that it was really um, promising. At that point, I really had something against most AI films because I don't think AI filming should be a thing. I think you should do films or movies or whatever, but I think AI is a tool like any other, even though it's building a process, even though it's extremely surrounded by controversy today. I still think that people don't care if it's AI or not, as long as it's good, as long as it's a story. And so I work mostly on that. Like, what do you want to say? What is the arc? Who's the character? Why would we care? How do we make him personal? For example, the first scene, you see the fox yawns. To me, that was an important moment to make it feel relatable, like not just this cold animal, but something which has this kind of personality as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of back and forth, a lot of time trying to nail some very specific aesthetics. I wanted to really go from some scenes with a certain art direction to a different, I mean, similar but different kind of a mood. Like, and you can see the colorimetry is moving from scene to scene. So yeah, so it was, I didn't expect that feedback, honestly. Like I knew I had something special, but then when it got really like, I got, thousands of reactions, 50-50 positive, negative. But yeah, that was fun. That was interesting, and that also put a lot of pressure because it was hard to follow after that. I had the feeling that it's hard to live up to the expectations. You know what I mean? Like
Oh, of
when you read
course.
something that people are like, "Oh, this is great," and like, okay, next one cannot we, be just nah. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's a really interesting parallel that you drew, right? Because the fox was a byproduct in some ways of the constraint of the system at the time, which is analogous in a lot of ways to like in any art school or film school. They'll tell you great stories are told under constraints, where what is the most you can do with the greatest number of constraints possible, where you strip out all the complexity and just go back to the fundamentals. So it's just a cool analog to think of that, it's not all that different with generative systems. It can actually inspire creativity in new ways.
no, it's spot on. I think so you're extremely right on that, and that's something I always have done in my career because I started in a really small market, which is Belgium, and most clients didn't have the money to pay for shooting or to pay for 3D and whatever. And it's been like 15 years of turning lemons into lemonade and seeing what you can do. And I think AI is the same, right? Like every new version of something has limitations, and a lot of people want to tell the story which they care about, but despite what the model can do best. And I think that's a mistake, right? Like you use it for what it does great, and find a different solution for something else. Versus having a deep film because you tried too much with the tool you had in your hands.
Before the advent of these tools, a film like Kitsune would have required, months, if not years, and a full team. How different would the process have looked like for you if you didn't have access to VO at the time? And were there specific barriers that access to the technology dissolved in your creative process?
First, I wouldn't have done it, right? 2D animation is something which is extremely time consuming, which is obviously a lot of skills, which so by definition it's costly, right? And those films, those movies, you still see them being done extremely well by some art schools in France, for example. I know Gobelin, for example, in Paris is still doing those by students, and it's amazing. But it's also an insane amount of work. They're working on this for months with very big teams. And I'm not saying that the work is a problem. It's more, if you don't have the skills from the start, which is one of the controversies with AI, right? Um, it's challenging to get into it. The same way some people are using it today to do VFX, or like it's kind of lowering that access. And that's, I think, the first reason why I would likely not have looked into it. Um, and also, like you mentioned Disney, but they had this golden era of doing those films until they switched to 3D. And then consumers didn't want to do 3D anymore. And then studios didn't want to do it either because it was too much money.
Yep.
And so I think there's something magic about being able to use new technology to bring back some aesthetics which were kind of half lost because of cost, basically.
You curated what, over 1,700 final clips, something like that, from
Yeah, I
VO2
think
for Kitsune?
there was kind of a guess at some point. I know I have still 1,700 clips on my hard drive. So this I know. I guessed I should have generated something between 5 and 7,000 clips, which in terms of cost, when people say, "Oh, it doesn't cost anything," not true. I think there's at least for 20K of generation in there, which thanks to Google, I don't have to pay for. But I think curation is a big part of what we're doing today. The more we go, the more the tools allow you to control. But I think it's still needed to be fully curated. You need to know what you're looking for, what's good and what's not good.
What does your tool set look like in practice throughout that process? Was it just VO2, or were you blending in other generative technologies and, different
Yeah.
layers of models and providers that were out there?
For Kitsune, it was only text to video, and it was only VO2 for anything which is animated. Then I was using, which is extremely backward because there's not a tool made for that, but I'm
Right.
using something called ScreenFlow, which is normally a screencast tool, basically. But to do my editing, I've been so used to the tool and I'm using it for everything. But so color grading was done in ScreenFlow, and making sure like everything was matching perfectly. Sound, I think I use something called Audio, which is a library which creates audio directly from a video clip you're giving it to. So you do not have to sync like the steps of the thought, for example. And then music, I had two versions of the film. One which was kind of Google friendly, which is using stock audio, and which is using Udio, one of the tools in the market to create
Yeah.
music, which I felt was amazing and better than Suno, which is one of their competitors at the time. So that's mostly the stack for this.
How did your stack evolve, Henry, from Kitsune to Electric Pink? Were there new tools, custom passes, models that you ended up deploying?
So Electric Pink is a film which was commissioned by Google for the release of their Flow tool, which basically is this kind of a new home for Imagen 3 and 4 and Veo2 and 3. The big difference I think with Kitsune is that I wanted to have more control. I wanted to explore a lot of different aesthetics, and I wanted to avoid having indeed 5 to 7,000 generations,
Yeah.
and focus on having shots I felt were exactly where I wanted them to be, and then animate them afterwards because VO2's image to video got released in between both. And so the way I worked on this one is really different, that each shot you see in the film has been created as a static image first. So I used Imagen 3, which is Google's model. Why Imagen 3? First, I mean, it was a Google commission, so obviously you want to see if they have something which is worth.
Right.
But I must say the tool itself is great because it allows you to do iterative creation. So you start your prompt, like mostly when I start on a shot, I have a clear idea or a clear-ish idea of what I want to do. And so I'm going to start. It's fast, so I generate something. I look at it. I'm like, not quite exactly what I have in mind. And I can, by just adding word by word, because of prompt adherence, so basically the capacity of the model to understand language, it is really good. And so what felt good to me with Imagen is that I could really build up scenes. Like it would take me sometimes 30 iterations from the first one to the last one, but I was really, it gave me the feeling I was having building blocks like a Lego. Like, okay, the mood is good, but then I wanted to feel more blue. So I went to, okay, like blue hues, and then up I get it. But
Yeah.
it doesn't drastically change everything like other models might do sometimes. It's, like you change two words and then you have something totally different. So that enabled me to create each shot individually, and then allow Photoshop. For example, when you generate an image and there's postures on the walls, the postures never make any sense. So I would remove them fully with Firefly, and then Photoshop back actual postures from the 80s of like movies and cartoons and whatever, which also was a way for me to place Easter eggs all around.
How did you sustain tonal consistency, Henry? Like in that cycle between you go from, prompt to generative output in Google Suite back to
Yeah,
potentially manually editing inside Adobe or wherever else, then you're
yeah.
assembling it. What's your secret to maintaining that cohesive vision when you're working across a suite of different generative tools at the same time?
I haven't been doing this for 30 years, so some might differ. But for the few things I've done prior to AI for work, the process is extremely streamlined, right? Like you going to start the script, and then going to storyboard, and then Imagen, and then going to do some woodboarding on the side maybe, and then you follow step after step. The thing is, the further you go, the more complicated it is to go backward. Like you're not shooting and being like, oh wait, we need to change the entire scenario. It's like, no, it's not. Like
Yeah.
too expensive to change, so too much risk. What I love with AI is that it gives me a chance to constantly go back. And you can improve. So it's very much like software development where you do iterative things like agile development. Like for a while it was like the one thing people were discussing, which also showed its limits. But I like the idea that AI gives you flexibility to move things in different directions. And so the way I do is that I start generating. I have a core ID, I have a core script, but not everything is extremely nailed to the word. And I start editing like when I'm 20% in, maybe in generations. So, normally I could wait until the end and then start editing and then see. I like to see quickly how it feels. And so I'm going to have a few shots, put them in editing software, start putting a rough edit together, and then with like holes everywhere. Like, okay, those 5 shots are together and there's a hole of like 40 seconds with nothing. And then this one, I think, is going to go there. And by just having this, it gives me already an idea of the rhythm and how fast I want it to be, and what kind of a pace I want to have. And it's draining too, but a lot of it was at some point was filling gaps. Like the more I was
Yeah.
filling, it was like I had a film at some point was like 95% done, but I knew those 5% would be really difficult to get because, but also when I had like at 99% and everything was already there, I still change sometimes the audio I came back to because I was using as a AI for the generation of audio. So I changed the voiceover and I rechanged some of the generations. And so to me, it gave me a much better film that way. than if I had done like a typical process where like when it's finished, like you look at it and you might be thinking, oh, that could have been better if I done that.
Henry, the creative firewall is this term that I've been using to describe the boundary between machine generation and human intention. The line that every artist puts into place to make sure that their creative authenticity and voice stays intact in a world filled with generative models. So for you, where does the line sit? And where do you say, like, look, this is the point at which I will not surrender to the machine and I hold on to Henry's artistic vision and voice? And I'm curious, like, if you have an example of that in practice.
I always go in a project with obviously an idea of what I want to do, but there's an idea of the constraint of whatever I'm going to do. I think basically identifying the tools I'm going to use and the workflow I'm going to rely on is something which happens really early. And so it's basically a phase of R&D, right? Of research. And that gives me quickly a lay of the land of like, oh, you're not going to go there with a story, or you're not going to do that, or like maybe that's not the right project for that. I know I'm an art director before anything. That's what drives me is a lot of the aesthetics of things, but also I know that bad storytelling is the worst, right? And so if it feels wrong but it's pretty, that's not going to work out for me. And on the other round, if I have a really good story but like visually like doesn't work, that's not something it's not going to work out either. So I think it's kind of a mix of this plus constraint and seeing what is the best outcome I can get from the constraint I know and the tool set I know I have.
So to that point of you being, an art director first and foremost, when Veo2 or any of these generative systems surprise you, right? It
Yeah.
gives you an output that maybe you weren't quite expecting. How do you evaluate whether it serves your vision or it crosses that line?
So when you've been in this space for long enough, you spend a lot of time doing R&D, right? You spend a lot of time trying new things again and again and again and again. And with pretty much anyone I have discussed with at some point, we start to have, all of us, I think based on our personal taste and culture and expectations, we have those things we're trying. So for example, my go-to is illustration. I love illustrations. So every time I try a new model, I'm like, okay, how good it actually is at creating something. Like I want to see an oil painting and I want to see how a video model would understand an oil painting would be moving. If it was, like let's say the world is made of paint, how does it move, right? And I think a lot of the work is based on that. So I think that's mostly how I'm going to estimate if a tool is going to work and define that line is I have it's not a real sheet, but it's more like this, that checklist of like, did I want to try it, did I want to try it and see how good it is. My go-to for any video model was like, can I do animation with it? How good
Yeah.
is it? And can I actually do this kind of a 90s, 80s animations.
It's so fascinating to me, right? Because in a world with thousands of outputs to choose from, one of the questions that's always been top of mind for me is how do artists prevent over curation and not getting lost in the abundance and still having that very human rhythm within the selection process? So it sounds like for you, it's just going back to the art director instincts. You know what that checklist is, and you're using that as your guiding heuristic, regardless of how many generations you're picking from.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of direction. But then also the more it goes and the better the tool gets, you need less curation. You learn faster on your vision. And I think that's the point, right? Like a lot of people are complaining that AI is like rolling a dice. To an extent, I think it's still true for some of them, but it's going really fast towards like a lot more control and just deciding exactly what I want. And then, like there's no excuse then. If people don't like whatever you created, then your vision wasn't right or it wasn't the right project or
Though that would have happened in a non-generative model world too, right? That's just making
yeah,
art.
no, definitely. I think the excuse now is like, yeah, no, it's easy, but it's not. I think that's not that easy to have a clear vision and to articulate something. Even though the tool allows you to do anything you want, if tomorrow would give you like perfect AI, which can just translate whatever is in your mind. Not everyone's going to be a filmmaker. Not everyone's going to be an artist. And I think it's an easy excuse, but I don't think the issue has been technical. It's extremely personal, I think, to create.
I think a lot about machines almost like mirrors in some ways, Henry, where sometimes these generative systems, when you use them enough, echo back some of your unconscious habits back at you. So creatives have described to me, oh, sometimes I see that recurring color shift or a framing that I didn't even know was part of my aesthetic, but it's learned me so well that it reflects it back. And so I'm curious if the tools ever taught you something new about your taste or your voice, or a pattern that you discovered reflected
Mm,
after using the technology for a period of time?
So I think one of the, see, if I look at what I'm doing right now, I think part of it is also tied to the limitation of the tooling, right? Like, for example, I know that if we look at video, it's 720p. That's the max resolution. And so
Yep.
I tend to use a lot of noise, animated noise, and sometimes some kind of cinema scratches as a texture, because I think making it looking like it's analogic makes it more forgiving towards having low resolutions. I think that's just, once again, as a case of just making lemonade. And that becomes at some point a signature because I think this is where we are. So I don't like the idea that if you look at AI outputs, a lot of it still feels sometimes synthetic. And I think adding those analogic defects and those small things remove part of that perfect aspect. The second thing, which I did notice, which is true, is that I personally do go back a lot to my upbringing and what drove me growing up, or it does feel a lot like personal therapy these days. I like to look into things which activate your heart in a way, or your feelings, or like you can identify to. For a while, I wanted to do something on loneliness. I think loneliness is one of the worst things which can happen to someone. I think, lonely and alone is rough. Like, despite of anything happening to you in your life, I think doing on your own is rough. So this drives, for example, a different script I'm working on, and grief. Both my parents passed away from cancer. To cancer. That's something I mentioned in Electric Pink. The story you want to tells more about you as a person than the technology you're using.
How does the creative process change for you, Henry, like in this generative landscape when you're working alone versus working with a team? There was a filmmaker who described to me the shift as I'm still directing. I'm just directing machines instead of
Yeah.
directing people on set. I'm curious for you how it's changed your creative practice, if at all.
No, no, 100%. It's it's definitely the same. It's it's really like, yeah, like you're directing a team, or like you're a chef in the kitchen, and then indeed like everyone is there and say, okay, you do this, you do that. That's why when I mentioned I'm doing editing, what I'm generating, what I'm actually doing some sound design and retouching pictures at the same time. And if I have like, oh, there's 1 minute of generation, I'm going to shift and then retouch whatever I have, or like go back to my script. I think that's kind of feeling that part of enabling me to direct a lot of things happening at the same time versus having to wait for someone to be done and then in 2 days, okay, what do we do next? And it's really literally like being in a train at full speed and trying to bring it to destination. But you can't slow down. You have to keep going, and that's both exciting and sometimes really scary because it's a lot and it's draining too. I finish
Yeah.
every time I work on film, I don't notice how tired I am at the end of the day because your brain had to, do a lot of things at the same time constantly. Even though it's generating, you still need directing and doing different things at the same time. Yeah.
Electric Pink premiered at Tribeca this year, which huge. Mega congratulations on that. What
Thank
did
you.
it feel like to see an AI generated film included in that context?
Yeah, I think it was the first like official premiere because obviously it was already online, and I got a chance to play it at a conference I was giving in San Francisco in May. But a few things. One, so happened definitely because Google was involved, and that was the part of the flow release, I would say. So grateful to Google for that because they let me absolute freedom. Like, I created exactly what I wanted to create. But also they opened those opportunities. Like, being a Tribeca is amazing. Now, I think what's great is that I didn't have the feeling that I was getting there with a lesser film, which wouldn't deserve its space. Like, I believe in what I created. Also because of feedbacks I got so far on it. I wasn't part of the audience, but I got feedback from the team of Google, which was there, which actually is similar to the feedbacks I got so far, which to me is the best. Is I had like people walking up to me after the conference and the screening, saying that they cried. Like, they said, "Look, I watched it and I couldn't help it that I cried." And that's definitely what I was trying to achieve this film. I wanted to strike, is it strike a chord? I wanted people
Yeah.
to identify. And I think the entire film was a personal story, but I wanted to open doors for anyone and to see whatever they wanted to see. And I had a girl who walked up to me and started crying after me. I saw that she was struggling, and so she started crying and saying that her grandmother just passed away just before, and that reminded her of a lot of things. I had a mom who came to me and said actually that she was struggling with her son because he was a perfectionist and he was drawing a lot and he was struggling with the idea that what he was drawing wasn't exactly what he had in mind. And by seeing that there was a scene about like, having space to draw and create, she wanted to know how it felt. Some people came up saying like, look, it made me really emotional at that moment or that moment, that moment. And I think that's the best compliment I can get on anything I create, especially when you have extreme public figures like Guillermo del Toro, who said that things with AI film would be just like a screensaver at best, and that they would never create emotions. And I did agree. I think stories matter. People identify to stories. Technology doesn't really matter, and I think this film is a good example of people just they felt something, and that doesn't matter how it was done.
Yeah, it's a great segue into my next question, which is, I think there are critics out there that argue that AI generated or even AI assisted output isn't real art. So I'm
Yeah.
curious how you respond to that critique. And beyond defense, how do you as a creator define art in this new paradigm?
So I always created since I was a kid, and I always struggle with the idea of art because it's so something you define yourself, right? Like I think art is something you do for yourself, and people can criticize, but at the end of the day, like if it just pleases you, then good, you've made art. I do think there's stories, whether they move or they don't, if they're audio or they're visual or whatever, but I think the stories, and as human beings, we're wired to connect with stories. And I just appreciate that AI gave me a chance to explore a lot more of my universe. Like if I look at Electric Pink and if you look at Kitsune, they happen within 6 months. And even if I remove the budget question, yeah, I cannot compress the timeline that much with a team. Like it would have taken a lot more time to create this. And so it gave me a chance to explore uh, the stories I want to tell in a fraction of the time. It's still a lot of work, it's still constraints, still a lot of things, but I can have a more mature voice as a filmmaker if I keep doing this in a few years than some people in a lifetime. Because I will have be exposed to more work, and I will, sometimes succeed, sometimes fail, and I will fine tune what I think is right. I think that's what AI is. It accelerates the process. It gives you a chance to explore more and to try more and to see more reactions, and it's overwhelming, but at the same time it's amazing. Like I can just compress time suddenly.
Yeah, there's your mic drop moment, Henry. If only that was the last question.
All
That
right.
was a beautiful response. Okay, so I mean, in addition to being an artist and doing a ton of incredible creative work with generative systems, you've invested actively in
Yeah.
companies like Stability. I think Leonardo in its early
Yeah.
days, Blockade Labs. What connects those investments for you? And then, relatedly, what kinds of builders or ideas do you believe are going to shape the future of creative technology?
So the fact that I got to invest in those companies was extremely. I mentioned Perfect Storm before. That was the same, or like or Bermuda Triangle. I don't know, but it was. So my company got acquired 2 years ago, and it gave me a bit of extra cash, which I never really had access to before. And this happened at the same time I discovered AI, and at the same time companies were selling the market. And after 6 months of doing this, what was interesting is that you quickly see when there's a game changer, and there was a lot less than you have today. Today, like every 2 days, there's a new model. And so when Stability came out, it felt like extremely powerful compared to anything else in the market. And I believe in that in life, if you want something, you just can ask. And sometimes people will say no, sometimes we say yes. And so I reached out to Emad, who was the CEO back then, and just asked like, "Hey, are you looking for some funding?" And they were actually closing their seeding round, and that's how I got in. Leonardo, kind of Sam, I knew one of the founders because we were in the same space doing art, and I just asked, and I felt that they had an extremely polished tool quickly, like UI wise, UX wise. The tech behind was basically leveraging other models, but they were smart in how they were building things, and that felt good. So I think it's definitely good timing, but also it was about people who are disrupting the market with new things. And since then, I've been looking at companies which are always maybe will change, but AI enabled somehow. But from the last one is acrylic robotics. They're using robotic arms to paint with acrylic, and using AI to do computer vision and know how to reproduce something perfectly. And the market for that, right? Like if you look at hospitality, right? We've been surrounded by bad art for years and printed in the cheapest way. And suddenly you have a company which actually can make actual paintings.
That was one of the most soulful and true answers that I've gotten in a really long time about investment strategy. So that was really
Good.
good. Everyone go to Henry for investment advice. Okay, if you could whisper one request, Henry, to a generative model provider, anyone that you use that you think would be the single biggest unlock for you in your creative process, what would it be?
So being able to create plates, like separate layers, basically, like I want that character, that one, and that one, and I want the background. Right now, everything is mixed up, so you have to restart all the thing. That's one. Obviously, more control over movement. I saw someone actually worked on open source to create a spline control system, which I still don't get why most players didn't do, which basically you do a spline and movement in that way. Like that's, extremely logical to have better control. And then, because I know there's a huge market for it and everyone's looking into it and no one's resolved it yet. What I did with Kitsune was extremely in the box because it's Veo, but 2D animation. Everyone is trying to revive different kind of franchise and get into 2D animation, but there's no real good solution right now. 2D difficult, it's getting mushy fast and everything. And so, I mean, we've done in the past, but you still, which is in a way great, but you still need a 2D animator, and AI is kind of filling some of the gaps, but it's not perfect. So I think that's a huge market to look into and a huge problem to solve.
All right, parting question for you, Henry. For artists who are just stepping in to using Gen AI tools and they're feeling curious but cautious, afraid, nervous, I think all the feelings that the creative community is feeling at large, what would you tell them to do as a first step?
I don't think AI is stripping you from creativity, even though the machine is controlling some of the things. I think creativity is how you use it and how you decide to bridge different tools or like whatever you're doing with it. So there's that. So it means that anything is good. I think what I always tell everyone is just to get their hands dirty. Like it's easy to complain today. It's easy to say because you're scared and you want to say it, but I'm not scared and I get it. They're like, oh no, it sucks because X, Y, Z. And you can just stay on the sideline and complain, or you can just be because it's not going to stop. I'm percent sure. Just try and to get your hands dirty and whatever, like start a Midjourney account and just prompt things. It's not for just, take a video account and start generating stuff or like give yourself a goal, like a small project, to do a film about something. But I think the first step is like anything, like we always say, when a body is in motion, it stays in motion. I think it's the same. You just have to get started versus just reading headlines and complaining.
Henry, thank you for your time. This was an awesome conversation. I think the thing that has stood out to me about all your work, but also stands out in this conversation, is just your sense of authenticity and the way that you've kept that alive throughout the entire process, right? Like it shows up in the themes that you're exploring in your films, it shows up in your investment decisions, it shows up in just your philosophy around the way that technology plays a role in creativity. You feel very, very true to who
Trying.
you are. Yeah, and always have been. I think that's a great model for just creatives everywhere to aspire towards, right? So this is very inspiring to me too.
No, thank you. And yeah, maybe just the last word on that. I think who you are as a person and the culture you have and the taste you have is what is the closest to you, right? And as the tools are getting better, I think the best bet you have is to bet on yourself and what makes you you. And so you can either like copy existing directors and whatever they've done in the past because you love them, or just do your own thing. I think that's what I chose to do.
Well, you just premiered at Tribeca, so you can only go upwards from here, no pressure.
Exactly. We'll
Amazing.
see.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.